monitor because he is a research assistant with Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Texas State University. They have a bat project, and so he is very involved in that and drives all over the state. And a while ago he said he really wasn't sure where he was. Anyway, he goes all over the state setting up the bat monitors, and they are audio monitors. So anyway, he is going to tell us tonight about some of his information that he has gained from that, as well as just telling us some information about bats in Central Texas. I think we all know we have bats, but I didn't know all the different kinds of bats that there are. So anyway, he's going to give us some good information, and we appreciate his sharing that with us while he's on the road.
Absolutely. And I'm going to mute now.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Okay, Carlos, well, you can take it away.
All right. Let me see. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. I want to thank Mrs. Carroll for inviting me for this talk. So just kind of a brief run through. I'm Carlos Garcia. I mentioned I'm a research assistant at Texas State University, helping with Texas Parks and Wildlife with this pretty big project monitoring bats throughout Texas. And so what I am doing is, for this presentation, we'll probably kind of give you guys an idea of the importance of bats in general, which, coincides with bats, in Central Texas. So just to kind of get into the festivities, boo. It's now in October, and how funny that y'all got this, put together in October, and we're talking about bats. So bats really got this bad stigma back in the 1800s due to Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, which released back in the 1869, I believe, 1870s. And since then, bats were notorious as these evil beings throughout the centuries up until probably the 20th centuries, whenever we started really focusing how important these bats were, and kind of started getting away from this stigma of bats being, bad. And so we have these legends and these myths of bats that people are very common, that I've commonly heard, especially now that I'm driving around all throughout Texas. And I can say that I have already heard some of these myths and legends. Some of those sayings that go, well, I'm blind as a bat, or that all bats have rabies, stay away from them. Bats will nest in your hair if you have these, big hairs or curly hair, they like to nest in your hair. Bats will suck your blood. And then in general, bats will attack people. Well, I'm going to go through these kind of really quickly and kind of debunk these myths really quickly. So the first one was blind as a bat. To be honest, bats are not really blind. They can actually see, and the reason why they and they're pretty active at night. When we go out at night and set up nets to catch these guys, they actually can see these really thin monofilament nets. We like to say that we catch the dumb ones because they fall into the trap. And so what these bats do is they rely on these echolocations, emitting these high frequency sounds in order to get information back from these obstacles. And this is how they move around and maneuver and find their food. Another, to debunk the second one, all bats have rabies. That is also incorrect. Although rabies should be taken seriously. If you see a bat that's injured or acting funny out flying in the day, steer clear, call your local wildlife agent, and let them know. So there's a recent study that did, depending on the bat species, about 0.6 to 0.25% of wildly caught bats tested for rabies. Even though that's pretty low, again, if you're not trained or are unsure about a particular bat, call your wildlife agent, your local wildlife agent. Another thing, bats bite. Well, yes, they do. They have very, very sharp teeth, but that's only because they need to open certain spines and beetles, hard-shelled beetles. And so of the 1,300 bat species in the world, there are only 3, and they're only located out in South America, Central and South America. So on the left, you can see that your common vampire bat, Desmodus rotundus. Then you have your hairy-legged bat, Diphilia caudata, and then you have your white-winged vampire bat, which is the Damas youngi. We've had an instance of a common vampire bat in Texas. It's recorded in Texas, but we call that somewhat of a fluke. It could have flown in through a storm or lost its way and was found here in Texas, but that was the only one and only instance that we've had so far. So no, we do not have to worry about bats sucking our blood. And even if you were in South America, these bats tend to stick with livestock. Myth number 4, bats want to nest in your hair. Bats are mammals. They're not birds, so they do not make nests. They do what we like to call as they sleep in roosts, either man-made, such as you have your culverts, your bridges, your bat roosts. You have your caves, and then you have rock crevices, and then just simple foliage. Bats will roost, or some bats are pretty opportunistic in where they roost. And so kind of give you guys an importance of bats and why bats are so important. They promote biodiversity throughout their ecological regions, as well as support the health of their ecosystems, such as they are well known for pollinating and dispersing the seeds of plants. For example, certain cacti at night only bloom at night, and so that's a very important role for certain species. Also, I'd like to throw in, anybody like tequila? If you do, bats play a huge role in the making of tequila, as far as pollinating those tequila agave plants. The amounts of insects bats consume in a single night, as you can see, this little chubby monster, chubby little bat flying around. Bats tend and will eat as much of their own weight throughout a night. And so bats have a very huge economic value in that they serve as essential pollinators for very certain plants that we all consume in our daily lives, such as bananas, mangoes, and guavas. And they also provide a very great economic value to agrosystems. They reduce farmers' needs for pesticides. There was a study in 2011 where they reduced the pesticide bill of agriculture industry in the U.S. by 22.9 billion on average a year. Moreover, this study, there was another study that calculated the annual value of Brazilian free-tailed bats, where they looked at eight different counties in South Central Texas that produced cotton, and that alone saved them $741,000 in pest control alone. And so going back to talking a little bit about roosts, and this is kind of what I kind of did in my master's, so learning about roost significance of bats. So roosts, like again, are where bats like to stay and sleep or hibernate. So roost selection plays a very prominent role in bat ecology and evolution. Roosts are very important because they're used for the protection from their natural environments, such as storms, wind, fire. Roosts are very, very, very important in mating, rearing their young, social interactions, hibernation, their digestion of food, and protection from predators. So as Christy and Susan have mentioned, they've seen bats in these bridges. These bats will sometimes use these bridges as what we like to call night roosts. Well, they'll go forage throughout the night. They'll go to this night roost just to digest digest their food and poop, and then they'll go out again, and maybe they'll roost and sleep throughout the day on some other roost. So again, roosts play a very important role for bats. So the type of roost, the number of occupants, roost associates, and roost activities are all influenced by different types of things, such as the manner of flight of the bat, the orientation of how the roost opening is, and this is all different for different types of roosts. The type of food that's around the area, how close it is to water, and also depending on season. This is where I really focused on during my master's, is looking at the different types of roosts between winter and summer. And so what kind of roosts are there? I kind of mentioned them somewhere at the beginning. There's man-made structures such as bridges, culverts, and bat boxes. We have caves, which, really most of our bats tend to, that we know of and that we've seen, have all been cave-dwelling bats. They facilitate group substructuring and also serve as heat traps that enhance metabolic rate. And what that means is, what it does is it controls the temperature inside to where the bats don't have to use their energy reserves while they're hibernating. So it controls that temperature, and that's why bats like to hibernate in caves. There are also types of roosts such as rock crevices, which only provide relatively permanent roosts, but typically they use those kind of as, like I've mentioned before, night roosts. And then there's other types of roosts such as foliage, which is very temporary, but offers very minimal protection from temperature and humidity. The main type of roost that I focused on were trees. Trees offer protection from fluctuations in ambient temperature, humidity, and predators and weather. This is actually a bat. That mold that you see on its back is a transmitter that I attached on this little bat to be able to track it to that specific tree. Trees do have their disadvantages in which they offer limited roosting space especially for this colonial type of species, such as, like we all know, the free-tailed bats. They roost, and they do roost in abundance. And then with trees, they do eventually rot and fall, which do require bats to relocate periodically. So again, a little bit overview of my master's work at TTU. I did my work in Louisiana in the Kisatchie National Forest. Those green dots are all of the locations where I set nets and caught bats in the Kisatchie National Forest. And so what I did was I specifically focused on a threatened bat species now in Louisiana called the northern long-eared bat. And our main objective was to see if there was a difference in summer and winter roost selection. And so I'm not going to go quite into detail of my master's work, but so our main question, our hypothesis was, what was the difference between summer and winter roosts? And so what we did was we measured tree characteristics such as the diameter at breast height, so how wide these trees were, how high these trees were, and then we also looked at stand characteristics. So from the actual roost tree, we wanted to see how dense the understory was, how dense the canopy was, how many trees were in the plot, so on and so forth. And so we also noticed that most of these roosting studies have only been done in the winter because they've all been done in the Northeast. And obviously bats hibernate in the Northeast and do not, come out in the winter. Because we had the opportunity to work in Louisiana, where bats will do what we like to call, they go into torpor, not hibernation. So what they'll do is they'll go into torpor, which they'll reduce their metabolism, and as soon as it go into somewhat of what we call like a hibernation, they'll reduce their metabolism, and as soon as it gets warm, they wake up and they go and they forage. So they don't go into full hibernation. And so with that being said, most of our studies come from summer work, and our work essentially kind of found the same type of information as all other summer works for this specific bat species. So my question again was, well, what is this bat species doing in the winter? And so, not to bore you guys with the statistics and what I did, but I did a discriminant function analysis to see what type of bats were, what type of trees these bats were looking for in the winter. And as we can see on the discriminant function analysis on the bar, we see on the red that these bats chose tree density over tree size. So it's very explicit, very differentiated when it came to the winter, which was really interesting to see. Okay, so now moving on into the Texas statewide bat survey, which is how I met Mr. and Mrs. Carroll. This project initially is we're looking at the activity and occupancy of bats throughout Texas. Why are we looking at this? I don't know if you guys know much about bats, but there is a disease called white nose syndrome. It was first discovered in the USA back in 2006 in New York. We believe that this fungus was brought over from Europe through cavers. So this fungus has been in Europe for many years now, to the point where bats have already evolved throughout time to fight this fungus. Unfortunately, our bats have not. And so this white nose syndrome comes from this fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which I'll refer as PD from now on. And as you can see, there's it's called white nose syndrome because on the top right you can see that very prominent feature where this fungus grows on the nose of these bats. And so PD in Texas was first discovered here in Texas, and we beforehand we can see this fungus creeping down south to Texas, and so Texas Parks and Wildlife started surveying in the cave systems and culverts, bridges, and discovered in 2017 until 2020, we have now discovered 17 counties that do have PD, the fungus, not the syndrome that kills the bats, just the fungus. But this year was a year that they actually found in Gillespie County a dead cave dwelling, a cave myotis covered in white nose syndrome, and tested, and it was confirmed that the syndrome is now here in Texas. So what we're doing is following the protocol, the NA-BAT protocol, the North American Bat Protocol, where it randomizes. It has over 7,100 cells that cover the entirety of Texas. And so what we're focusing on is the top 200 cells randomly selected throughout Texas. Here's a cell that it's a 6.2 by 6.2 mile square that is divided into 4 different quadrants. And these quadrants are about 3.1 miles, 3.1 by 3.1 miles. And so what we're doing is we're deploying these monitor stations, 2 of them within this 6 by 2 square mile plot. And what we're also doing is that these monitors have to be, since we're doing 2, each monitor has to be 3.1 miles away from each other. So when it comes to the nitty-gritty, it does get kind of hard in order to find those certain requirements, especially when you're working with landowners or with Texas Parks and Wildlife, trying to find people who are willing to participate in the study, which has been great so far. And so here's kind of what the monitor station looks like. Here's a picture of me and Mrs. Carroll here on her property. This is the bat detector, and this is kind of what Texas looks like with those top 200 cells. Kind of looks like it has chicken pox, but this is kind of what we're dealing with. There's 8 different districts. I don't know if y'all know much about Texas Parks and Wildlife, but there's 8 different districts in Texas Parks and Wildlife that has divided Texas. Where Mrs. Carroll is located at is in District 4, north of Austin. I am currently in District 2, which is over here in the Panhandle by Amarillo. So far, we have been able to deploy in districts 1 and 2, which is districts 1 is in the red to your left, which is the Trans-Pecos area. District 2, which is the Panhandle where I'm at now. District 3, which is that green area left of Dallas. We have deployed detectors in District 4, which is there where Mr. and Mrs. Carroll are. We have deployed detectors in the orange, District 5, as well as District 6. We are currently working on District 7, which is that Houston area, and trying to find landowners in District 8, which is South Texas. Relatively covered quite a bit of area for the state of Texas. And so the reason why we want to cover this the entire state of Texas with these monitor systems is to figure out the activity of our bats throughout for 3 years, is what we're looking for. And within these 3 years, we hope to see, kind of track our bats to see if they're being affected by this white nose syndrome now that it's here in Texas. So here are some images of some other landowners and the thing about the project is we're going to survey different areas of Texas, different types of topographical areas, different ecoregions, which is really, really, really beneficial for Texas. There's even a picture I got caught at night. And so going back a little bit to our bats in the central in the areas here, I have bats that are in the area between the cross timbers and the Texas Blackland Prairie. So between these 2 ecoregions, we have 8 species that we have in common in these 2 ecoregions. In the cross timbers, we have the southeastern myotis, and in the Texas Blackland Prairie, we have the northern yellow bat. And so kind of to conclude on how to help with your bats, if you all are interested, is to build your own bat house. There are a couple of websites from the National Wildlife Federation as well as Bat Conservation International that have pre-made bat houses for you to set up. But if you'd like to get your hands, they also have a kind of a how-to with the instructions on how to build your own bat house. You can also build your own bat garden. What is a bat garden? Well, interesting enough, there are certain flowers or certain plants that do attract different types of insects that bats like. And so that's also a thing you could do. And then again, just in general, if you run into a bat, contact your local wildlife service. If you come across any bats. And then with that being said, I would like to thank Ms. Susan Carroll for allowing me to talk with the Native Prairies Association of Texas. Really do appreciate it. The Texas Parks and Wildlife, my 2 universities, Texas Tech University, as well as Texas State University. And any questions?
So what would you put in a bat garden? What kind of plants?
So that's a good question. I've never really looked into it very much. That's something I can look into for you. I recently started hearing about that this year, which is kind of a new thing for me.
Yeah.
But there is such a thing, and I can definitely look it up and get you more information for that.
That'd be great. And also, so I actually have 2 bat houses that I built at a workshop at Bat Conservation International, but I'm not sure where to put it. So like those prairie bats, do they use bat houses, or do all bats use bat houses if you put them up?
So not all bats will use the bat houses. Some bats are only tree roosting bats. So they'll only use trees. And the bats that will use bat houses are the very opportunistic type of bats. So your tree roosting bats are typically going to be your if I go back, are going to be your Lazuras from the family Lazuridae. So that would be your eastern red bat, your hoary bat, your Seminole bat, and your northern yellow bats. These are going to be your tree roosting type of bats.
Okay.
More than likely, the bats that will use the bat houses are going to be your southeastern myotis, the cave myotis, the big brown bats, the evening bats, and then of course the free-tailed bats. So some bats will only use certain things as a roost. Some of them are pretty picky.
So,
but as far as your setup, I think if I'm not mistaken, you don't want to put it too close to the edge of like a forest, because bats would like to kind of get enough area where they can see when they're coming out that there aren't any predators.
So that property on the rolling plains that we have, would the southeastern myotis be out in the Colorado City area? Is that a bat that's in that area?
I don't think so.
Okay.
The southeastern myotis will cut off. It will stay in the eastern part of Texas.
It's more eastern. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. If you'd like a list of the area of bats, I can definitely do that for you.
I would be very interested. We have properties all around the state, and I've wondered, we have quite a few larger properties closer to Texarkana and east of Dallas in that northeastern part of Texas, and could be kind of interesting.
And Carlos told me to get this book.
Oh, you got it.
Oh, okay.
And it's really a wonderful book. And the reason I like it, and what Carlos was saying about it, is that they have beautiful illustrations, but then they show where the bat will be in the state, and they'll have little dots to where you can find it. So I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, I haven't really, thought about the range of bats. But I did, I have bat houses, and I've wondered where I should put them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a couple of questions, Carlos, about do bats migrate?
Yes, ma'am. Again, going back to those tree roosting bats that I mentioned earlier, we call them the Lazurid bats. For example, I'm going to list them out again: the eastern red bat, the hoary bat, the Seminole bat, and your northern yellow bats. These are the bats that typically do migrate. Their distributions come all the way from Canada and will go all the way down to Mexico and South America. And then as you all know, the Brazilian field-tailed bat also will migrate from North America down to South America as well. But then you'd also have bats that will stay here year-round and hibernate. And so it's those bats, like I mentioned before, that do hibernate in the northeastern areas, have been completely been devastated because of this white nose syndrome. It's killed about 90% of a population of a certain species. It's completely decimated it in the Northeast because they don't migrate. They stay here in the U.S. and they're cave dwellers, and so they stay in those caves throughout the winter.
And I think you'd said that cave dwellers, that promotes the virus or the whatever, the white nose, because they're in this cold, damp cave, and that it's conducive for that to grow. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, ma'am. Correct. So, and that's another reason why, well, I personally, in my opinion, I don't think white nose syndrome will affect our bats as much here in the South because it doesn't get that cold. But it will affect I think it will affect our cave dwelling bats because it stays at a constant temperature in there. And this fungus grows in humid and cold environments. So I think our tree dwelling bats, are bats that don't, typically use the caves. I think they will be okay, but like our tricolored bats, our big brown bats, some of our free-tailed bats will probably get this fungus because they do use those cave systems.
And there's no treatment. I mean, how do you treat a bat?
So they have been able to treat bats of white nose syndrome at sanctuaries and release them back into the wild. But there hasn't been a treatment that we can release into the environment because that's just a biohazard. We can't just release something that might potentially cause a cascading effect on other species.
I had another question about insects. Are there certain insects, I know it depends on the species, I suppose, but are there certain insects that bats like more than others, or do they just eat whatever is flying around?
Well, it does depend on species, but what we've seen in previous studies, the vespertilionid bats, such as your southeastern myotis, your cave myotis. I'm just using these as examples because you guys have visuals. Your cave myotis, your evening bats, your big brown bats, they all like, there have been multiple studies that they really do like their moths.
Oh.
And so that's what and typically the moths and the caterpillars of moths are those those really bad species of moths that affect our crops. And so it's really beneficial to have these little guys flying around.
So I know people say that they eat mosquitoes, but they really don't eat mosquitoes, right? I wish they did, but
yes, not as much as they do eat mosquitoes, but not as much as people hype them out to be. They will eat. It's just they're not. The nutritional value of a mosquito is not as great as a fat flying moth, right? And so they will eat their mosquitoes if they have to, and they will just because it's opportunistically they will eat their mosquitoes, but they do like their moths and beetles.
So something doesn't necessarily have to be flying. It can be crawling around on the ground. Is that right?
Correct. So yes, ma'am. Certain bat species will only catch in the air. There are other bat species that we call them gleaners, Gleaners, gleaner. What they'll do is they'll skid right above the water and eat the bugs off of the top of the water. There are other bats, it's not shown here, called the pallid bat, Antrozoas pallidus, that have evolved to fly to the ground and eat scorpions, centipedes, and other critters on the ground. And they've evolved to crawl and not to be affected by their venom. They're just here. So the thing here in the United States, we have 40, I cannot remember the US, 44 species of bats in the United States. Texas alone has 33 of them. So that goes to show Texas does have a good chunk of our bats, just because we're so big and so much diversity in the ecoregions for these bats to live in. And most of our bats that we have in the U.S. are insectivorous bats, only eat insects. And then we have 2 species of bats that are nectivores, which means they only eat nectar. But then there are other bats, such as the ones I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation. They're called sangivores, which only get their nutrition from blood. Again, you only find those in South America. Then you have pescivores, which are bats that only eat fish. I think I'm missing some. Oh, and
Are they in
frugivore.
Texas that eat fish, did you say?
Yes. No, there's none here in Texas. Those are only bats that you'll find throughout in South America and in the eastern continent that only eat fish. And then the frugivores only eat fruit, like your a well-known cute bat that everyone knows is the flying fox. Those won't eat meat; they just eat fruit. That's where they get their nutritional value from.
Well, we have a back porch, and we like to sit on our back porch, and we get a lot of mosquitoes on the back porch. And when the swallows, the barn swallows, are here, the barn swallows keep the mosquitoes pretty well devoured. And then the barn swallows seem to go south and hibernate for the winter, I guess. They leave. And then we think that we have mosquitoes that get on our back porch, and we think that we have bats that come eat the mosquitoes around our back porch because, we can just go out there with our shirt sleeves and shorts and get a bite or two, and then pretty soon there'll be some bats that'll come sweeping through there, and they sort of clean up the mosquitoes, and then they go away for a while. That's just anecdotal. There's certainly no scientific study, and I would yield to anybody that knows the facts, which I certainly don't know. But I just look around out there sometimes and see a mosquito, and I say, "Well, you wait till the bats get here." The bats will take care of you.
They will. They're more than likely they will. If that's the most abundant type of insect in the area, like mosquitoes. If there's it's all relative, right? So if there's more mosquitoes than there are moths, they're going to eat all those mosquitoes. Just to because they have to eat, and they have to keep that. I mean, just flying alone takes up so much of their energy. And so they will eat. If there's more mosquitoes than there are moths or beetles, they're going to go after those mosquitoes just to allocate that their energy reserves.
So is there a particular habitat that they prefer, or does it depend on the bats? I'm wondering about bats and prairies. I'm just curious. Like grasslands, are there bats that like grasslands, or do they tend to need trees?
They will tend to need trees. There hasn't been a bat that I've looked or learned that likes to roost on the ground. That's just too risky. And then some bats just can't fly off from the ground. They can't pick themselves up, is what we call it. So some bats do need a certain height in order to drop and fly to catch that first flight.
So
So they will need some type of a tree or off the ground type of environment for them to be able to roost in.
is there like a minimum height for a tree that they would prefer?
Well, there are some different. That's the thing. Some species do like different types of heights.
Okay.
For them to be able to lift off.
Okay.
So if you had a savanna kind of where you had some
Yeah.
trees, but then you had grassland, I would think the bats would like that because they could roost in the trees, but then they also could swoop down on the prairie and get a lot of bugs flying around.
Yes, absolutely. They will definitely take advantage of those trees. If you're in a savanna and there's only 2 trees, you're going to find some bats in those trees, taking advantage of that.
So kind of they might like edges, right? Edges of forests where they can roost in the forest and then fly out into the open areas.
Into the open, correct.
Okay.
Then you'll have some tree, well, not too close. If there is ephemeral streams throughout a forest, kind of like a vein system that's kind of open throughout the forest, they'll use those ephemeral rivers and streams to navigate throughout the forest. It's pretty interesting.
So Leland has a question. He said, are night lights good or bad for bats since they attract bugs? Are ultraviolet bug lights good or bad?
They're actually, if they attract bugs, bats are going to go for the bugs. But there is a pro and there is a con to that. With the lights, I don't see any harm. It's up to the bat to risk it for food, but they do expose themselves to other predators. Being so open in the light. Another thing we're looking at for this Texas project is we've attached what we call a hobo that's going to be recording temperature and light, whether it comes from light from the moon to light from the city, or light from someone's backyard. It will be recording that, and we want to see if there is an effect on bats in the area because of light. There have been studies down in South America that there are some bats that are called lunar phobic, which means that they're scared of the moon because during a full moon, it's so bright that they're seen by predators, and so they will not forage during the full moon. Those 3 moon phases during the full moon. And so here in Texas, I think it is beneficial for our bats. You get the lazy bats that like to stick around those light posts, but then it can affect them in the end by getting eaten by an owl. That choice goes on to the bat itself.
I have a question about predators. We know that the owls would be certainly a predator, but do predators ever go to their roost to get the bats, or is it just something that like when they're flying?
There are certain predators such as snakes that are really good climbers, and once they find themselves a roost, a maternity roost, or a colony within a roost, they will climb and get themselves a snack from that roost. So snakes are really good at that, especially on trees. I'm trying to think of others that are really good climbers that I can think of. That's all I can think of on the top of my head as far as climbing up to the roost itself would probably be snakes.
Carlos, let me interject one thing. If it's from me, it's not scientific. It's just anecdotal. But I have been sitting on the ground at the Kickapoo Caverns state natural area, about sundown when the bats come out. And you just watch them and they just come flying out and flying out and flying out. While they're flying out, you can see there are some hawks that are flying around in the area. And from time to time, you can actually see a hawk dive on a bat and catch it. And the bat's defense in that case is that there are numbers of them. You've got 1 million of them or so flying out, and the hawks can only eat, half a dozen. So it is possible that you can see those hawks diving on them. Leland's got an intelligent question. I'm sure. Go ahead and let's see what he says.
Oh, that's just, thanks.
Okay.
Leland was just saying he's going to go watch the debate.
Okay.
It's 8 o'clock.
Well, do you have a comment on hawks flying around and
No,
diving on them?
no. I think that's a pretty, strategic plan for those hawks. I mean, if I was a hawk, I'd be doing the same thing. That's free food. I've also seen the same type of behavior at Bracken Cave. There's a couple of hawks that do the same thing. An owl that will show up, and just as soon as sunset comes around, they'll perch on those trees where the bats are coming out, and they'll just feast to their heart's content. There's also, I think, a snake. Snakes will do that too. They'll slither up to the opening of the cave, and as the bats are coming out, we'll catch them a bat. So I think that's just an opportunistic behavior for those raptors and reptiles.
Yeah, people have noted that pretty regularly in those colonies that take off at sunset. Usually there's some raptors there hunting as those bats are leaving.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, Carlos, this was wonderful. I appreciate
thank you.
talking to us, and Kirsty is recording this, so